Thank you for joining us for the Writer's Desk, AWP's virtual conversation series. This episode is titled We're Still Here, Disabled Writers on Claiming Space in a Time of Disability Erasure. I'm James Tatehill, AWP's Senior Publications Editor and a fellow disabled writer who is going to use his screen reader to introduce our moderator today, who is one of the first people who came to mind when we were putting together this conversation, and her bio will tell you why. Sarah Fawn Montgomery is the author of Quite Mad, an American pharma memoir, which The Atlantic says exemplifies a nuanced approach to life with mental illness, and the Paris Review describes as the wake-up call that we need. She is also the author of the essay collection Halfway from Home, winner of a Nautilus Book Award for Lyric Prose, the craft text Nerve, Unlearning Workshop Ableism to Develop Your Disabled Writing Practice, the flash collection Abbreviate, and 3 poetry chapbooks. Fathom is forthcoming with the Propel Disability Poetry Book Series. She is an associate professor at Bridgewater State University and the founder and editor-in-chief of Nerve to Write, a magazine for disabled, chronically ill, and neurodivergent writers. Sarah Fawn, I am going to hand the reins over to you, and you can introduce this all-star panel, and I'm so excited to hear what you all have to say.
Thank you, JT. It's really wonderful to be collaborating with you. You do so much in terms of celebrating disabled literature and bringing us together in community, and so it's always a pleasure to work with you. I also want to say thanks to AWP for sponsoring this event for Disability Pride Month, and also for elevating disabled voices all months, because it's not just during Disability Pride Month that we need to be talking about visibility. And of course, thank you to our panelists. This really is a dream team of panelists. I think we're going to learn a lot together today, and be able to really have an important conversation around equity in publishing, and also really an empowering conversation about claiming disabled identity on and off the page in this really sort of volatile time for disabled people. And the last thank you I want to give is a thank you to folks who are watching at home or in bed or in the bath or wherever you may be as you tend to your body and your brain. I always say that CRIP community is about all of us, and so we are happy to be in community with all of you today as well. So what we're going to be talking about today is this act of claiming disabled identity in a time of disability erasure. So disability has long been ignored or invalidated in publishing and literary spaces. Many disabled writers discount it altogether or pressured to write for abled audiences if they hope to succeed. Of course, today's current social and political attacks on disability rights continue these ableist traditions of disability erasure, removing us from public conversation and thereby increasing that pressure to perform disability in particular ways, many of which are detrimental and even dangerous if we want to gain access or acceptance. So in today's conversation, we're going to be discussing equity in publishing, examining the challenges that disabled writers face in the publishing world. But we're also going to be focusing on strategies for claiming disabled identity on and off the page, for tending to our bodies and our bodies of work, and for finding purpose and agency as disabled people living and writing today. So it's our hope that today's roundtable will continue an important conversation, but also help build really necessary CRIP community. So I want to start off by welcoming this dream team of panelists. These are all writers, scholars, and activists who I have learned so much from as a reader, as a writer, as a scholar myself. These are writers whose texts I use frequently with my students and in my classroom, and I'm so honored to be here in conversation with them today. So Emily Rapp Black is the author of Poster Child, a memoir. The Still Point of the Turning World, which was a New York Times bestseller, editor's pick, and finalist for the PEN USA Award. Sanctuary, a New York Times editor's pick. Frida Kahlo and My Left Leg, and I Would Die If I Were You, Notes on Art and Truth-Telling. A former Fulbright scholar, she was educated at Harvard University, Trinity College Dublin, St. Olaf College, and the University of Texas Austin, where she was a James A. Michener Fellow in Fiction and Poetry. the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. She's received awards and fellowships from the Ronajah Foundation, the Gentle Arts Foundation, the Corporation of Yaddo, the Fine Artworks Center in Provincetown, where she was a winter writing fellow, and Bucknell University, where she was the Philip Roth fiction editor in residence. Her work has appeared in Vogue, the New York Times, the Times London, Lenny Letter, the Sun, Time, the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, the Oprah Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, and many other publications. She's currently professor of creative writing at the University of California, Riverside, where she also teaches in the School of Medicine. She lives in Southern California. Khairani Barokka is a writer, artist, and editor from Jakarta, based in London and working internationally. She has a PhD by practice in visual cultures and has been a UNFPA Indonesian Young Leader Driving Social Change, a Delfina Foundation Associate Artist, an Art Forum must-see, board member of UAL's Special Board for Archives, Museums, and Libraries, associate artist at the UK's National Centre for Writing, and editor of Modern Poetry and Translation. In 2023, Oka was shortlisted for the Asian Women of Achievement Awards. Most recently, she co-curated the Disabled Legacies Festival for Paul Mellon Center and directed 4 short films under the Kirkland Poll Project for Grand Union on Southeast Asian crypt-disabled intimacies. Her books include Indigenous Species, Stares and Whispers, Deaf and Disabled Poets Write Back, Ultimatum Orangutan, shortlisted for the 2022 Barbellion Prize, and Amok, longlisted for the Jalak Poetry Prize. Annah Infinite is her creative nonfiction debut, based on a 14-year art and writing project, and is a bookseller expert pick. Rapp Macaisa is the author of Colgate, is the author of the poetry collection Hardly Creatures, winner of the Chicago Review of Books Award, and longlisted for the Griffin Poetry Prize, and the verse drama My Love is Water. A 2026 Creative Capital, 2025 NEA, and 2024 Ruth Lilly Fellow. He serves as a managing poetry editor at Foglifter and lives in Chicago. So welcome to you all, panelists. It's really such an honor to be in conversation with you all today. We're going to just dive right in with our first sort of question or talking point. Today, we're going to be looking at how disability erasure in an ableist world translates directly into the writing world, as well as the ways that we've navigated this in our own writing lives. So to begin, I want to sort of start by asking you, what are some of the pressures that disabled people experience to perform disability for an ableist world in order to gain access, respect, and even things as simple as like basic dignity or acknowledgement? And what do these kinds of ableist expectations do to our disabled spirits? And I'm hoping, Emily, we can start with you.
I mean, I think for my perspective is that the performing of the ableism is performing a kind of overcoming. A sort of the erasure is designed to be in the writing. In other words, I've once met with an editor. This is 20 some years ago, or maybe it was an agent. I can't remember. And about my first book, and she said, "Well, I feel like there's just more trauma that you need to put in there." And I'm like, I think there's kind of enough. Like, I don't know, like 10 orthopedic surgeries, like, but I think the idea was like the sort of the pity object, right? And then the other side of that would be the overcomer, the athlete, the person who no one thinks of as disabled. Like, I think trying to find a middle way between those two very, recognizable tropes about what disabled people are, if they're of value, is challenging, and continues to be so, even more so now, given our current state of the world. So I think those are, and that's a path I think as a person I've been trying to navigate my entire life. And I think it just translates, as you said, Sarah Fawn, into how it comes across on the page or what's expected of me to do. For example, in the Frida Kahlo book, I talk a lot about sex, which was like really important to me, because I think there's a desexualization of disabled bodies too, which is ridiculous, but there you go. And I don't know, I think that's part of the performative quality, is sort of to fit with someone's idea of what a good disabled person should do or be or behave like.
Someone else jump in.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you said, Emily. I'd also like to say that this summer I received a pretty much unheard of apology in this context from a journalist who had interviewed me literally 10 years ago and said, "I'm so sorry that it was my editor pressuring me to ask for your diagnosis and for details about your disability. Um, I'm so sorry I pushed you like that and I shouldn't have done that." And I was like, well, that's good to hear. Also, that wasn't a great experience, as you can imagine. And it made me think, oh my gosh, you know what? Disclosure in general, about trauma, as Emily says, certainly, but just in general, disclosure in a way that is legible to an abled audience, I think is such a pressure that we always feel. And we speak on our, crip languages and disabled languages and sick, chronically ill languages. We have our own legibility for each other, and I think that is very valuable. And I just think that there's so often this fear that I worry about for students and mentees of mine, but just in general for disabled people wanting to get into writing, that they must disclose and they must put it all out there. They must reveal parts of themselves, traumatic or otherwise, that are legible for that abled audience. And I think having a disabled and ill audience in mind is so, has proven invaluable for me personally.
You have both spoken so eloquently on it. I think the pressure that ableist perform shows up to me most just in those spaces where it becomes really clear that abled folks just have no clue what the actual material of disability is and what the experience of both the disability as sort of like literal function in the body mind versus the disability as how society sees you because of that difference. And then lost it. Sorry, it's a little early for me. All this to say, abled folks really not sort of knowing what the material is. And I think a lot of what access looks like for me in particular, doesn't sort of read as access in the way that able folks might be expecting. Access, I think a lot of the time comes from a very physical space, and it's about making space or slowing down. But some of my access needs are socializing for much longer than an hour or two can sort of become quite triggering to an episode. And there's not a easy way to explain that. And then there's also the whole sort of able passing of it all, where, I'm medicating myself enough to be sane passing because I have to be able to just participate in the structure that allow me to stay alive. I gotta have a job and I gotta be sane to do the job. And so then I'm sane passing all the time, and there almost becomes a disability suspicion of it's you don't seem crazy, diva. And I'm trust, I'm doing this for y'all. I'm being sane for you right now. I don't want to. It's a suppression of a natural state, but for the sake of this day job, we're just gonna go ahead and take the Seroquel.
Yeah.
I love that, Rob. I feel the same way as a neurodivergent person. I think of autistic masking, right? And the expectation that you put this mask on to present a certain sort of neurotypical view of the world, or you perform in certain ways that are, like you said, just completely the opposite of how I conduct myself as an autistic person around other autistic people or around other neurodivergent folks. And other things that I think of, and I think this goes back to things that Oka and Emily said, are the idea of the inspiration narrative, or the narrative that you're doing everything that you can, and that you're accepting and tolerating and welcoming unsolicited medical advice from people who are saying, have you tried yoga? Have you tried essential oils? For me, as somebody with several invisible disabilities with lots of physical symptoms, also performing disability as somebody with invisible disabilities, and trying to perform what chronic pain is when I don't look like I'm in chronic pain. And for me, another one is the notion that we are cheerful. A cheerful cripple is a somehow much more tolerable cripple than a cripple that is angry or sad or just tired, just exhausted, right? And so, yeah, all of these expectations that we have for just the everyday world. And then those will, of course, lead into what we're expected to do on the page, which we'll talk about in just a second. I want to talk a little bit about sort of setting the stage in terms of where we're at socially and politically, because that is going to tie directly into where we are at in terms of publishing. So as we all know, disabled people are currently facing increased social and political attacks on the disability rights that a lot of activists worked for many years to win for us. I want to ask us to maybe speak to some of the most dangerous recent political attacks, and then where you fear that disability erasure might be headed given our current political administration. And Emily, I think I had you start off last time. So Oka, can I maybe have you start us off this time?
Yeah, sure. So geographically, I'm in the United Kingdom. I am from Indonesia, and everything that is happening in the United States is deeply tied as well, unfortunately, to the alliance between leaders of both the country I live in now and the country I am from. Cuts to USAID, for instance, really deeply affect people, but it also ties into what a lot of my Indonesian disabled scholars have been talking about for years, which is this aid dependency on supposedly developed countries. And then when that is cut, so many disabled people suffer. And for the United Kingdom, years ago, the United Nations declared this country a humanitarian disaster for disabled people because of the conservative budget cuts to social services, which is a phenomenon I know that you all are also experiencing. And yet at the same time, there's an increased demonization of us as benefit scroungers and, sort of welfare hoarders and all of this stuff that is, it's evil. It's evil. I don't know how else to describe it. It is evil. And it becomes to me like increasingly, sadly, every year it becomes even more acute to me how much of a difference disabled voices in media and publishing and in literature are and need to be. So I'll just start off there.
Yeah, I think what you're saying about the the criminalization of bodies that are different is really interesting to me, and it's something that and terrifying. It's something that I think has increased in intensity in the last 4, 5, maybe 8 years of being presented with all the time of a sort of right way to be, which is a very narrow way to be. And yeah, I think for me, I think a lot of it has to do with it's kind of what Sarah Fawn you were saying about earlier with expectations. I think that I think the experience of disability, at least for me, is deeply tied to expectations around like the bootstrap myth. And if you try hard enough, you can get yourself out of a situation or, get yourself out of a body, which of course is patently ridiculous. But I think there is that kind of push right now. If you look at sort of our political state of, it's the kind of try harder, the try harder trope, the try harder thing. Like you're not trying hard enough to contribute or, be a functioning cog in a wheel or whatever. And I think that is disturbing because people aren't products and they're not vehicles for productivity and just the sort of attitudinal and access to critical resources that you need to do your job. Like to be in society, you need to have certain things that other people may or may not need. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I think it's disturbing. I mean, and it's disturbing that it's happening kind of worldwide, like a lot of other disturbing things at the moment. Like it's just sort of all of a piece, it seems to me.
One sort of like political moment that has stayed with me over the past few years was the murder of Jordan Neely back in 2023, who was a schizophrenic man suffocated on an MTA train. It's with me so much. There's a poem in Hardly Creatures about it, and the crux is sort of that abled folks out in public will sort of begrudgingly make space for disability but a lot of the time that does happen in terms of like physical space, wheelchair sections, moving around. But then we've also seen them make space for non-physical things. Um, when there's like an evangelist on the train or at the station shouting, there's still space being made for that. We ignore them, we let them shout. But as soon as that disability is taking up non-physical space, like a mad person being mad in public, that is sort of like where a line gets drawn about how to make space for things. Um, and I think too, sort of just as troubling as the murder itself was the fallout in which the madness, the schizophrenic diagnosis was really being used as sort of an excuse, as sort of like this is why it makes sense that they killed
Right.
that man. And it's certainly a reason. That's definitely a big reason of why it happened, but it doesn't excuse anything. Of course, obviously, it goes without saying. And just like sort of like the online chatter and discussion around that, I remember sort of feeling troubled in the same way that like back in like the early 2000s, I would be on like early Facebook or Tumblr or something, and sort of the casual homophobia, like people weren't even aware of how like prejudiced they were being because there just hadn't been an education for it. And now it's a little harder. I mean, it's getting easier, but it's a little harder to be like that homophobic on Maine. But it's actually still quite easy to be quite ableist on
Yes.
Maine from people who identify as leftist, as liberal, whatever. And so I think like I fear there's like a reckoning with disability that is going to be left behind in this like push against fascism, because people just sort of aren't aware of like the stakes and what it takes to be inclusive in that way.
Yeah. Oh, ableism is like the language. It's stitched into our culture. It's stitched into everything. And I mean, I find myself using it too, like, or hearing it, and then I'm like, stopping myself, saying certain words that are very common, like lame, or, the crippling economy. I mean, there's all kinds of those sort of, if you're aware of it, you notice it. And it's interesting to, like, when I talk to, talk to my students, and I say, like, count how many times you hear ableist language, and they're like, oh my gosh, I never realized before. So I think, to your point, that's absolutely true. It's just sort of, it's understood that it's okay to be openly ableist, whereas in other situations around other people who aren't in the majority culture, it's not.
100%. Whereas, as Sins Invalid taught us, disability justice is fundamental to liberation, right? You can't, we are the leaders, the visionaries, and we have been, in terms of how to create a livable society. And I think thinking of us as an add-on rather than like we need to be the very base of this of liberation is quite wrongheaded, and unfortunately is like really widespread, as you both said.
Absolutely. Let's take this and sort of turn our attention a bit to talking about equity in publishing, because everything that we've talked about sort of everyday ableism, and then also what's happening socially and politically, unfortunately has found its way and continues to sort of spread across publishing. So that same sense of disability erasure. So I wanted us to maybe start off with speaking about some of the common challenges that disabled writers face when it comes to publishing. And of course, there's so many things that we could focus on. So this could be everything from ableism in creative writing programs, which I've spoken a lot about and written a lot about, the pressure to perform disability for abled audiences, which we touched on a little bit already, but there's much more to say, a lack of publishing opportunities for disabled stories, or the fact that a lot of markets that do publish stories about disability are doing so by abled authors or for abled audiences, which is always a really sort of tricky business. So Rob, if you don't mind, I'll ask you to maybe start us off with this one.
Yeah. I mean, one, like in poetry, it's a little different than in prose. It's so expensive to try to publish because really the only route is through book contests or open reading periods, or sort of having the privilege to be in spaces where you can network into a publisher. And it's just like my health insurance premiums are like expensive enough. I can't pay $50 to send you my book. But I also think my response to this is more feeling the ableism of the publishing industry, in that publishing is really mandatory if you want to keep writing at the center of your life, because it allows you to perpetuate a career in a more capitalist space. And if you don't do that, then you're not subject to all the, you know, the web and the junk of publishing. But then you don't get to really keep writing at the center of your life. You have to do some other work. You have to really carve out time to really build a life around writing. You have to publish to establish some sort of career. And like for me personally, anything public facing is like incredibly challenging. I am too mad to sort of be like knowingly looked at through the book. And so it's just something like I like put up with. You know, I'm so grateful for having been able to publish. I love my press, all this stuff. But the fact that I have to do it if I want to be a writer, the fact that I sort of have to go out into a public sphere and perform some sort of authorship when I want to be a writer, I think really troubles me. It feels, as a disabled person, almost impossible to keep writing at the center of one's life in a way that is otherwise sustainable.
So if I can add on to that, so Anna Infinite, thank you for saying it took 14 years, Sarah Fawn, because I'm actually proud of that. Some people are like, I know abled authors who hear that and they're like, oh my gosh, I would never, you know, and it's like, hey, it took the time it needed because I had to deal with a lot of stuff that was very psychologically difficult to write about, you know, and it took a lot of rewrites. But it's also the story of how I hurt myself over and over again to be able to be an artist. The move from Indonesia to the UK alone as a migrant without any access to public benefits for 10 years was not easy. And it was actually so painful, literally, in so many ways. And I don't want anybody to ever go through that, you know? I feel as though this question of the center periphery model and like where the networking, where the opportunities are in big cities usually, and even in London, you know, I live on the outskirts. But I think we have the most expensive public transportation in the world or something like that. But even without taking into account costs, a lot of opportunities are in the capital cities or in the main cities, so that people, disabled people in rural areas, find it difficult to access networking spaces that are only in person and somehow not hybrid yet. And then also it's a question of, I mean, I'm not always well enough to go into town, frankly, right? There's so many, I don't even want to think about like all the networking opportunities I've missed out on because I just can't go. I'm not feeling well enough. I can't do it, or it's in an inaccessible space. And I think that there needs to be, I think there needs to be an understanding of how important hybridity in terms of events and networking spaces is, but also alternative spaces for networking, which are online, which do happen, especially amongst disabled folk. But in general, I think just resources and migrant justice, because, you know, providing benefits for migrants, if they, I mean, regardless of legal status, is something that is really dire of an issue. And I think it needs to be baked into any conversation about immigration rights and justice.
Agreed.
Emily, do you want to jump in at all?
No, I'm just thinking about what you said.
And I'm taking notes.
No, I absolutely agree with all of that. I think, and the networking stuff too. It's like, especially if you have a non-normative body or a non-normative way of being in a space, like it's just so exhausting to do those events and have to answer the same questions and deal with the same triggers, if you will. it's just like, do I have it in me today? You know what I mean? To do that, like literally, physically, emotionally, mentally, all those things. I think people don't quite understand that. In part, I think this is maybe where I'm trying to go with this. It's a little early for me, so I'm like, how's my not thinking right? Is like this idea that anyone with a non-normative body can be asked any question by anyone at any time about their body, about their experience, about their very intimate life, their brains, their how their body works, how it functions, their diagnosis. Like people just have no boundaries around that, and that's something I've had to learn as an adult because I've had a visible disability since I was 4. Is like no longer answering those questions, or creating well, I wrote a book, so now I no longer have to speak to you about this because it's over there if you want to go purchase it at your local bookstore. I don't even know if it's still in print. I don't care. But I don't want to talk about it. Like, these are not questions you ask a stranger. They're very prurient, and they're intimate, and they're rude. So I think there's that element of it too, at least from my experience about the networking elements.
Yeah. I love everything that folks have said. Rob, you're the one that started us off, and I appreciated what you said so much about being the kind of person who doesn't want to like perform in public, because I'm somebody who my sole way of being is to be alone with my animals. It's the autistic way. Like I don't want to talk to anybody. I don't want to walk in a room with more than 3 people. I don't want to make eye contact with you. I'm just a very quiet, shy soul, and I get very easily overstimulated by many, many things. And then Oka, what you said about this notion of like, sometimes I'm just not feeling well in terms of having a lot of sort of physical symptoms with my own invisible disabilities. So like to go to a writer's residency, not going to happen usually because I don't know what kind of furniture they have and I require special furniture. I don't know how long it's going to take to travel there. I have pain flares. I don't know if I'm going to be in the middle of a flare. Even something like, doing a book tour, right? So I've done tours for my books that have been very painful and detrimental to my physical health. I've done all virtual tours, which I loved because I could do them and they were comfortable for my body and I was alone, right? Which was always what I want. Like I'm on Zoom, but I can be on Zoom and that feels safe in a way that a crowded room doesn't for me as a neurodivergent person. But those are received differently. So disabled folks loved the virtual tour, but a lot of abled readers didn't like the virtual tour. And so one thing that I will say, and I think this also sort of ties into what Emily was saying, was trying to figure out who my audience is. And that has changed from book to book. So my first book, which was about mental illness, was sort of written for an audience that didn't necessarily identify as mentally ill. And it was trying to kind of translate that experience. And now I don't write for that audience. Now I write for an audience that doesn't require translation. Like I'm writing for you all. I'm writing for us. And that has been really helpful to keep me from sort of performing disability. But it took a minute to get here and I'm still very much learning. So let's go ahead and we'll transition kind of into another question, this idea of, again, sort of performing. So because of this sort of pressure to perform, I know a lot of disabled writers will feel tokenized in different ways. So you might feel torn between wanting to write about disabilities in ways that feel authentic to your experience and your identity, but that might be ignored by mainstream publishing. Or you might feel sort of pressured to write about disability when you know that that's not what you want to write about. That's not your only plot and purpose, but that tends to be what people want you to write about. So I'm hoping that you could speak to this, how you've navigated this in your own careers. So how have you been able to claim disabled identity on and off the page? And if this has changed over time, that's something I think folks at home would be interested in hearing about. Emily, I'm just going to circle back to you since it's been a second since you started us off.
Yeah, it's interesting because my last book my most recent book is a craft book, which is about writing difficult stories. And it's not really about, it's got disability in there and it's got stuff about grief, which are my 2 happy topics that I usually grief. But I've been asked the same questions about my work in this round of, whatever publicity, mostly about my body and about my son who died of a terminal illness and he was 100% disabled like his whole life. And I'm like, wait a minute, like there's more to my life than those 2 things. They are, of course, hugely important. And I don't want to to dismiss that in any way, shape, or form. They have made my life as a person, as a writer. And so I want to claim that. But like, I also think I want to be like, but I like my life. Like, I mean, because I do. Like, I think that there's this expectation, at least for me, of like performing joy. But it's not even a performance. Like, I do love my life, and I do have many beautiful things that have happened to me and some sad things. But it's interesting to me, like 30 years later, being asked kind of the same questions, like, tell us about your disability. I'm like, I already did it. Like, this is about like making art. This is about anybody. Like, just stop asking me questions. And like, and your son, and then everyone gets really sad. I'm like, yes, it was really, really sad. And I've written about it, and it changed my life. But like, I don't go around carrying that stuff with me on a regular basis. It's just not who I am, and it's not how I live. And I think people have a hard time understanding, if you've had some extreme things happen to you around bodies, your own body or the body of a loved one, that you're just not constantly like, crawling around feeling sad, or, just like, ugh, like, it's just not that way. I mean, so I sort of feel this fierce attachment to being like, I'm happy, and that's a kind of performative thing, even though it's true. So I do feel like that I was so shocked in this last book, where I was just like, why are we like revisiting these things that I feel like I did a lot of work on? I want to talk about the making of art, which is for everybody. Not about my disability, not about my son. Those things I've shut the book on those in a writing perspective. So that I think has been a challenge, and an interesting and irritating sort of development for me, at least in the last year, half a year.
I think that what I've always tried to do is make it impossible for people to think of disability in terms of a binary of like, the woe is me character, or, like the super crip.
Right.
Right? Yeah. And if you do think of that, then I'm like, oh, you didn't actually read my books.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
You didn't read them. I don't know what you thought this was. But also, I write, most of my books are about environmental justice, right? And also about art historical archives and colonial and post-colonial history, because my training is in visual cultures. But I disability is infused in it because I am a disabled and ill person. So for instance, I think I kind of want to push back against people when they think they know what about disability means. Yeah. So for instance, in my book Amok, half of the book is a performance text from a performance lecture that was commissioned by university. And in it, there's like these brackets. And when I perform the brackets, I gasp, I go, oh! And that is actually kind of an inbuilt way of me incorporating my panic and anxiety, which I into a performance, because I always feel like gasping at some point when the anxiety of performance gets too much. So it was kind of my way of including that. But it's also about this gasp of like people in history. And that's about disability, or environmental justice is always about disability, because environmental pollution disables people, and disabled people are, endangered by environmental injustice and climate justice, and it's all connected. And so I think by just trying to engage with people who understand that our work is multi-layered, I think that thankfully after like so many years, I have continued to slowly minimize the amount of interactions I get with people who think in weird platitudes, but we always get them still, right? So if you do, it's just sort of like a dog whistle, like, okay, yeah, you didn't read the books, you don't know what we're about.
Right, if it's like a cross, something you can put on a cross stitch. No. Right? Like the like when God opens a door or whatever, God's doing something in the house, or there but for the grace of God, blah, or like the title of my book, I Would Die If I Were You. I hear that all the time. I'm like, that's just rude. Like, you don't know anything about me. Like, you would not die if you were me. You'd be a happy person with complicated things to deal with. but people are just like, what? So yeah, the binaries, those, it's so important. That's so interesting. I love the gasp. That's so cool. That the performative, that I love that idea.
Rude you've used, Emily, because we can talk about injustice, prejudice, we can talk about, what's systemic, but on some point it's like that's just rude. Like we're
Rude.
just people being rude to each other.
Yeah.
It's great. I also, Sarah, found really connected to what you said about sort of like writing for an audience who maybe wasn't familiar. I feel like when I wrote my book, I was like very conscious it was going to be an educational product, and I don't think, obviously that like it is disabled folks' responsibility to educate able folks about disability. I don't feel it's not our obligation, it's not our responsibility. But knowing that, I was like, but I am going to do it because someone's gotta. And it's also something that's given me a lot of peace therein is there's always another poem, there's always another book. And so something really concerted and focused on like, how are we going to communicate to this audience who just doesn't know and who I have to assume is almost a little dumb, which you never want to do about your audience, but you really gotta. Dumb and rude, I would even say.
Good.
Right. So I was like, but the next book doesn't have to be this. And then the next thing I wrote was like entirely selfish. And I was like, I don't care who understands. I don't care who gets it. I don't care how it's received out in the world. I'm like just gonna do what makes me feel good, and then even like you can do that project to project, but even poem to poem, I think poetry, we're so blessed with having such condensed units that I can get something very personal out of my system, and then I can sort of go and do the educational work. I think that's what I'll say.
Yeah. I have a funny story. My daughter is 12, and once we were in an elevator and someone started sort of, coming up to like getting really close and asking me questions, and she just turned to me and she's like, rude. And I was like, oh my God, my little protector. It was so funny. She was like, and
raised right.
I love that.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah.
I love that as well. So we got just a couple last questions that I want to get to. One of the things I often tell students that I work with is you cannot tend to your body of work if you are not tending to your body or your brain, right? And yet a lot of craft advice or the ways that we talk about publishing or writing kind of ignores the body, right? We're just supposed to be like thinking and writing and the idea of write every day, like write by hand and then type it out. And those are things that not every writer can do. I can't do any of those. So I wanted us to maybe spend a little bit of time talking about the things that you do, the things that are sort of affirming to you or helpful to you, that allow you to tend to both your body and your body of work. So this could be things like incorporating spoon theory, radical rest, changing your audience. So I'll just start us off. For me, learning to write with a microphone as opposed to trying to force myself to write by hand or to type has been really, I can no longer use a pen or type with a keyboard or a mouse. So everything that I do is with a microphone and assistive software, which is the best. Audiobooks, I can no longer hold a book. So I rely on audiobooks, which are also the best, unless the narrator is not my favorite, in which case it's not the best. But also incorporating radical rest. I'm someone who went straight from an MFA into a PhD, into the tenure track job. And this notion that you just go, and you churn out one book after the other is so unhelpful for a disabled body and mind. And yet that was the only thing that I was taught would lead to success. This goes back to what I think Rob was saying earlier about what you have to do to have that career. And so for me, becoming a writer that also feels good and enjoys writing as opposed to is forcing myself to write in particular ways has really been about like unlearning much of my writing advice that I was given in programs and unlearning a lot of what I did as a writer. So those are some ways that I sort of tend to my body and my mind. But I was interested in what works for you, knowing that what works for one of us isn't going to work for all of us, and we have to take some things and leave others. Oka, can I have you go ahead and maybe start us off?
Yeah, sure. And speaking of being also neurodivergent and brain foggy, I completely forgot like an access description. So I'm just gonna say I'm an Indonesian woman with a gray t-shirt on a gray couch with a white wall behind me. Um, yes, I think in my 40s, my goal is to live a more pleasure-oriented life, and we will see if that happens. But I am drawn to people and communities and spaces such as this one that actually make me feel good and more relaxed in my body and doesn't have me so anxious necessarily about ableism or certain performance indicators or being in hostile environments. And that can be very difficult to do because a lot of publishing is a hostile environment still for disabled people in various ways. But I think orienting myself towards that work has, like, if I look back at the past year, it's been like whether co-curating spaces or doing even like doing a duo show with a deaf curator. The one that you spoke about, Sarah Fawn, the short films about sick disabled intimacies, which is also a form of writing for me in terms of for the screen. When we met, the curator and the other artist and I about this show, we said we're not going to use the word care in any of the material to describe it, none of the publicity material, because in the UK at least, that word has been really co-opted by abled people who don't understand what the hell access and care for disabled people actually is. I feel like it's a buzzword, you know, like care. We're doing this thing about care, and then you go to some place and it's like really inaccessible. So I think like fighting back in those ways with co-conspirators. Like I think I'm always looking for co-conspirators, and using that word as sort of like a guiding light. So broadly, that's kind of the strategy.
I love that. I feel like this. I feel the same in terms of the collaboration element, the co-conspirator element. Like more and more, I like doing things with people that feel interesting and kind of wild but safe. I think, and just to your point, Sarah Fawn, the whole advice from writing teachers about writing every day, 4 hours a day, the same spot. You know, at some point I realized that, oh, those were men, and like they also had wives that did all the domestic work. Oh, so this is why I can't find 4 interrupted hours, and also I don't want that. Like that's not how I work. So I think for me, what I've developed is this sort of 10 minutes at a time feeling, partly because I have so many different jobs and so many things to juggle, but also juggle is not the right word. I can't juggle, but to deal with. But also just because I feel more and more the older I get that I don't need to spend time stressing while I'm writing. I want it to feel fun and I want it to feel joyful, and it always does in a 10-minute block. And then I want to come back to it versus this kind of what you were saying about productivity and like what are you going to do? And that whole mindset really, I think in my 20s stopped me from being happy, because it was just like, what are you producing? Like how many copies? Like that's just not where my head is at now. I just want to create things that I'm proud of with people that I like and trust and respect, and it'll find its way, you know.
100%. Yeah, right there with.
There's just like this sort of sense of like ease being really essential that I feel running through conversation. For me, what's so helpful is just clocking out of poetry and honestly of disability studies at least, and just vibing. Like I feel often like I'm like a shark sleeping one half of the brain at a time. And being able to sort of clock out and like go to my very related day job and hang out with my partner and go, you know, watch reality TV with my friends, like all of that is like so nourishing, because I just don't have to deal with the other part of my life that I love and I can't wait to go back to. But I feel like I've had periods in my life where I was working just like 8 part-time literary adjacent jobs. And by the time it was time for my own craft, I was like, I don't have energy to keep talking about poetry and disability. I was doing that all day. And so being really conscious about clocking out, and recognizing that like being a nourished person is sort of foundational to being a writer. Yeah, I just gotta not deal with it.
I'm right there with you. The Real Housewives, hi, like love all of them, especially the Rhode Island one. And I will say, like, if there's a movie with Gerard Butler in it with a one-word name, like Plane, I'm like, people are always like, why do you watch these dumb movies? I'm like, because I need to check out.
I need
And
something dumb. Oh my gosh, I need to be dumb.
on a plane, you know what's going to happen. He's going to save the plane. And like, I want to see it happen. I want to see that whole cycle complete.
Guys, can I check like how weird this is on a weirdo meter for you? But I got so into the Summer House drama, and I listened to so many recap podcasts, and I have never seen a single episode. But I just like, there was a time when I was just like binging recaps.
I'm telling you, it's real. It's real. Yeah,
I am also
refreshing.
I was I'm also a huge reality TV, bad music, like anything I listen to. I'm always writing really sad things, but listening to really like happy, like queer dance music. And because I'm autistic, it's on a stim loop, so I'm going to listen to one song for 3 hours. Like it's just a beautiful. Rob, you said like joy, like abundance is what I'm thinking, like ease, abundance, joy, like cultivation. And often what helps me the best as like a writer are things that have nothing to do with writing, but things that help me as a human, like cooking good food, eating lovely things. Like I love to garden. I just want to sit outside and grow flowers. Like just like rolling on the floor with my dog makes me very happy. So yeah, things that aren't the traditional like writing advice things. We've got one final question because we're almost at the end of time. But we began this conversation by talking about just the state of the world in terms of ableism and sort of social and political erasure. And so I always like to end conversations about this by talking about agency and purpose and like power. I always say that like the only thing more painful than being disabled is dealing with ableism. Like that's actually the more exhausting thing than like chronic pain or madness or neurodivergence, because it just takes so much like strength and energy from our spirits, from our stories. So I wanted to end by asking you all, what are the actions that give you, and hopefully by extension that give people who are watching this, agency and purpose? What is the sort of work and the community that motivates you to continue on with your writing, with your community organizing, with your activism? So I think, Rob, I'll have you start us off for this last question, and then we'll kind of go around to everybody to end.
Cool. And I'll have to jump off after this question, Emily. I'm so sad to miss your answers, but I'll just watch this when it goes live and then I'll hear them. For me, it's returning to the page. I think as long as I am writing and that can be at the center, everything else is accessory and everything else is worth dealing with. The Drag Queen Luscious Massacre just sort of had to put out this, not put out a statement, but was on a podcast and was talking about how she's like, I don't like it when the drag queens think they're so famous that they're showing up out of drag at events, because the whole purpose of what we do is to be drag queens, not show up looking like boys, which is, very broad generalizations. But I think that I don't like when it gets all about like everything accessory to the page, everything external to the page. I think really to protect a Crip writing practice and to protect Crip literature, like we need to be able to return to the page and do the thing that makes us feel like ourselves, that makes us feel like writers. Publishing is great. Panels are great. Interacting with people is great. But none of that can happen if we do not open the Google Doc, turn on the recording software, pull out the pencil, whatever it is. And I really think that's our power. So as long as we keep getting in writer drag, and like
love it,
doing the thing that should be at the center of what we do, I think everything else will fall into place. It'll be really hard and it'll really be taxing and it won't feel worth it all the time. But I do think staying close to the page is what's going to ultimately allow Crip literature to thrive.
Yeah.
Love that. Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, it was so wonderful to meet you all. Keep in touch, and I can't wait to watch this back. Thank you, Sarah Fawn, for having us.
Of course.
AWP and JT and everyone. This has been so wonderful.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Bye, y'all.
Bye.
All right, Oka or Emily, you want to jump in next?
I think Rapp said it really well. I mean, I think it is about just, I think most writers know that when you have a good writing day, it's kind of like no other feeling in the world, and it's just such a beautiful feeling and kind of wordless. I don't know if there's a name to put on it. Kind of floating above all the things, like what he said, by centering the one thing that is your mission or your vocation or your calling. So I think for me, that's it. Well, I love what he said about writer drag. That's the best. And I don't know. I think it's making writing not, and I think for me, saying at the center of my life, it means like for 10 minutes. Like I just don't, like that's enough. Like I have to lower the I'm such I think part of growing up with a disability and passing, I'm just like, oh, no, I got to write for 4 hours. I got to do more than everybody else. And I just don't do that anymore. I'm just like, I don't have the energy, and it's not interesting to me. Like 10 minutes at a time is interesting to me. Having many projects at a time is interesting to me. Everything else, I don't feel like I have to prove anything anymore. And I never really did, but I thought I did.
Oh, well said. I think one thing tying into what you said, Emily, is like to speak kindly to yourself, which is something I'm still working on. So I hope I can be better at that. And also what Rob said about nourishment is so important. I think also being inspired by other art forms, whether it's like a movie that can make me cry or a YouTube video that opens my eyes about XYZ, just being inspired by other people's creations. And allowing yourself to get lost in art, whatever that is, whether it's Real Housewives of Rhode Island with those beautiful brunettes, and the weed empire that I keep hearing about. Just allowing yourself to get immersed in fantasy, in make believe, or in just a joy, because then you can bring that to your own work. And I feel like, I mean, it's a cliche, but also like read, obviously, other people's work. I feel like when I haven't read something that really hits me in a while, my own writing suffers. So I think I have to be like really brought to the depths of emotion by other people's work is on a regular basis, and community still always, because it's again spaces like this that allow us to keep going.
Yeah.
Perfect. That was my final thing was what Oka just said, which is community. So, writing and being kind to myself and all the things that everyone just said. But for me, the thing that kind of lights me up the most is stuff like this, is community building. And for folks that are watching, I always like to, I get asked this sometimes when I do events and things. People will say like, well, how do I start a community? You're in it. Like you're in it right now. We are all here together. I think there's this notion that, if you're still trying to get your first book or your first publication, or you're starting an MFA program, or you think you want to apply to an MFA program, that you're not in the community. Like you are here, like we're in it. Hello. And so like reading and celebrating and, checking books out from the library and ordering books from, like, all those things are all part of that community work that we're doing. And that for me, that's what lights me up and gets me really excited. And so I think that that's a really nice way to end this conversation. So I want to sort of end this off by saying thank you so much to our panelists, to Emily, Oka, and Rob. Thank you to JT for organizing this. And then again, a big thank you to AWP for sponsoring this really important conversation. This is just a jumping off point for those of you who are watching. Know that there's still a lot to discuss, a lot to learn, a lot of different things that we can do to support ourselves and each other. And so, like I mentioned before at the beginning of the conversation, you're all part of the community. We are all in it together. And so we look forward to being in contact with you more. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, Fawn, Emily, JT.